We ask the questions. What is needed in the world? Is that going
to be? Despite so many meetings with European leaders to stop the contagion, the economic crisis in Europe is spreading, fast and with severe consequences. Spain, the most recent target for a European bailout, facing a potential run on its banks, European leaders promising hundreds of billions of euros to Spain to help calm the situation. But with a massive government debt and more than 24% unemployment, will the Spanish people get through this? José Luis Zapatero, the former prime minister, left office last year as the crisis was taking hold. He called for elections, hoping a new government would get control of the situation, and decided not to run for another term. Before the most recent bailout promises were made to Spain's banks, we decided to sit down with him to discuss what's been described as the most difficult political crisis facing the world right now.
Do you accept any responsibility for the rate of unemployment in Spain, for the state of the banking sector in Spain?
The former Prime Minister of Spain talks to Al Jazeera.
Prime Minister Zapatero, thank you first of all for talking to Al Jazeera.
Gracias por su invitación.
What is your reading of the situation in which we find ourselves, and what is the way out of it?
Es verdad que hemos vivido una crisis financiera.
Well, it is true that we are experiencing a financial and economic crisis, a really serious one. This sort of situation arises only every 70 or 100 years. Now, as we face these difficulties, we must have a coordinated answer. The countries with the most serious problem, they need help reducing their debt. They need to grow. And this means that other countries will have to do something to create demand. Now, what do we need? First of all, we have to complete a program of governance in the Eurozone. We need to find a solution for Greece, and we need specific growth policies, policies that have to come from the European Central Bank. It has to adopt a wider monetary policy in order to generate a recovery in the Eurozone.
When you say wider in monetary policy, you mean what specifically?
A que el Banco Central sea más activo.
That the European Central Bank becomes more active, creating monetary stability in the Eurozone. And to be more active in this area means that it has to be present in the sovereign bond auctions. There is proof that when the bank has been active in buying sovereign bonds, short-term speculators move away, and that's the responsibility of the central bank. And it also has to be responsible, in my opinion, for reducing interest rates. That would help the economic recovery. Those are two things that the European Central Bank has to do. And the other European institutions also have to do something to help create growth.
Growth programs are one of the sticking points. I mean, let me bring it back again, though, to the coordination and cooperation, terms that you just used. Part of the problem here is the confidence that people have in the individuals concerned. So let me put a specific question to you. Angela Merkel has been very firm in saying austerity, budget tightness, cutting back are the only ways out of this. Increasingly, it's looking as if she's wrong. Mm-hmm. Do you agree with that? And do you think, therefore, that a policy change is necessary?
Hemos combatido la crisis financiera y económica.
Well, we have to fight the financial and economic crisis in different phases and with different responses. And the one thing I know is, if we do nothing, we will have zero growth. I'm 100% sure that Angela Merkel knows that. I've met her many times. I know it's difficult for her to explain to her people, as you say in political terms, the difficult coordination here. Europe has created a single currency and one single market with 27 countries, with a long history of confrontation. And it's going to try to achieve a fiscal or monetary union. And relatively speaking, this is all going to happen in a very short time. It's true that the most perfect union in monetary terms required by our commitment to solidarity will take 3 to 4 years as a result of the crisis.
That's if we ever get to the point where the consolidation is necessary, because right now the most immediate problem surely is that the entire experiment is going to blow itself up, isn't it?
No. Está atravesando una situación difícil.
No. The euro is going through a very complicated phase. It's a very serious crisis. But Europe is stronger than the crisis. We know that the seriousness of this crisis requires time.
Nos exige tiempo.
If the situation is as sanguine as you suggest, and the possibility of getting out of this is as clear as you suggest, how are you going to communicate that message to the tens of thousands of people around Europe, and specifically in Spain, who are going out on the streets every day? Your unemployment level is at record highs. Your bond prices, or the interest on the borrowing that you are having to do, is going up, irrespective of whether your system is improving or not. People are ganging up and taking positions in the financial world, on the streets, and in the political world. They don't seem to agree that everything is quite as rosy as you're suggesting.
Bien, sabemos que estamos en un momento difícil.
We know we are going through a difficult time. And during the period when I had to deal with the serious financial crisis, we went through very difficult times. There were high bond yields, then they came down, and now the situation is complicated again. I know that in the European Council, even though there is a feeling that they always act at the last minute, I know that there has been a political response there at every turn. But we shouldn't and can't forget, this is the most serious crisis we've had since the 1930s. And we know that a financial crisis as serious as this one will be long. It will take years to overcome. And it's understandable that citizens demonstrate because they are suffering severely.
But do you, on a personal level, I mean, you are now out of office, but over the course of your term, there's been an enormous change in the state of the European economy. Do you think that any of this is down to any of your policies? Do you accept any responsibility for the rate of unemployment in Spain, for the state of the banking sector in Spain?
Bueno, todos tenemos, como es natural, responsabilidad.
We all have some share of responsibility. I would say that the common structure and setup for the euro when it was designed didn't envisage the possibility of a sovereign crisis of this magnitude, because the common currency doesn't allow for devaluation. And that was the traditional response from governments. Between 1991 and 1993, there was a very serious crisis, and Spain devalued its currency 3 times. And that allowed us to recover our competitiveness and growth. A common currency brings benefits, but this sort of devaluation is not possible. So we have to keep up with reforms because the currency is a part of every country.
El todo tiene que hacer su esfuerzo para ayudar a cada país que tiene la moneda común.
If I understand you correctly, what you're saying then is that this problem is one that was generated outside of Spain. It was a global problem that Spain is simply suffering through with everybody else. Your role in this was as a passive bystander.
No, maticemos. El origen de la crisis está en Estados Unidos.
The origin of this crisis was in the US and its financial system. Because growth was excessive, the financial tools were weak, and that resulted in contagion for the whole financial system, and in particular for the European one. Spain had 2 decades of very strong growth, but with lots of external funding. We invested much more than we were earning, and the situation became more difficult when the financial crises happened, because it cut off all sources of financing for our economy.
Nos tocó esa circunstancia.
Of course, and again, you are a victim of circumstance to a certain extent. Does that make you feel angry at
porque
the situation?
Evidentemente, sí.
No, because obviously, if we had saved more and borrowed less from abroad, we would have suffered less from the consequences of these crises. So the clear lesson is that despite the common currency, in spite of the euro, external imbalances and deficits transcend all borders and affect all of us. That wasn't clear in the Stability Pact. When the euro was born, there was the deficit and public debt. And in that regard, Spain was fine. Our problem, however, is the external deficit.
And can I just stop you on that particular point? Because again, you were a victim of circumstance, and the Spanish debt was and is not as bad as many of the European countries, certainly not as bad as the situation in the United States. And yet what we have now is we have a situation where the United States housing market, which was just as big a bubble as yours, has managed to a certain extent stabilize itself, and the country has managed to regain its footing. The German debt, which was much higher than yours, hasn't affected their borrowing.
Yes.
Hasn't affected their borrowing capacity one bit. They have interest rates at very low levels compared to yours, maybe 1/5 of what Spain is having to pay. And yet you have, to a certain extent, all this cost you your job in a circumstance where you're being treated far from equally in all of this. Doesn't that make you slightly annoyed?
Sí, bueno, muchas veces he pensado, ¿no? ¿Por qué Gran Bretaña,
I have often wondered why the UK, with a deficit higher than that of Spain, spends half as much as Spain does to service its debts. And there is a clear answer to that, and it is that the Bank of England has 5 times more treasury bonds than the European Central Bank has Spanish bonds, and the UK managed to balance its risks. We have to change our model. Parts of it need to be changed. However, I must repeat, the Spanish financial system is widely recognized as the most competitive, most productive, and has gone through a deep restructuring. Until today, of all the European countries, our financial system is the one that has received the least public aid. And I am 100% sure that our financial system is going to handle all of the reforms and changes, and it's going to be able to stay efficient.
But surely the question is not whether it's going to take it well or endure. It's a question of, will it actually survive? I mean, your banking system is under enormous pressure now. The initial steps that you took to shore up some of the cajas is beginning to look very ragged around the edges. We've seen Rodrigo Rato having to step down because of the crisis that's going on. We've seen your borrowing rates going up. And a lot of very high-level economists are predicting a run on Spain's banks. I mean, again, the situation that you are facing in this crisis is very, very different to the situation that Germany is facing, the situation that Britain is facing. Doesn't this cause you concern?
Bueno, pero Alemania, cuando se inicia la crisis financiera, es...
When the financial crisis started, Germany was the country in the Eurozone with the most difficult situation, and it needed the strongest injection of public funding. We have resisted a bit longer with our own system by making a massive restructuring from 45 to 17 entities. And whenever we have had banking problems in Spain over the last 30 years, the public sector has shown that it is possible to manage a financial entity, to rationalize it, and to make it competitive, and to get back into the market without any cost to its citizens. That is what has happened in Spain. So, we have already had a banking crisis.
In completely different circumstances, though, surely. I mean, these are not comparable scenarios.
No, circunstancias también difíciles.
They were very difficult circumstances. Once a crisis has passed, we tend to forget. But in the 70s, we faced a very serious oil crisis. And in the early 90s, again. And people were thinking, no, there will be no recovery. We will lose an entire generation. I remember that well. I was at university. My country had the same unemployment rates as today. But in 4 or 5 years, we managed to recover.
So your message to the indignados, to the people on the streets in Spain and around Europe, is keep on taking the
Es que
medicine.
tienen muchas razones
There are a
para
lot of
hacerlo,
reasons to do so,
pero
but they
que
have to
confíen
trust in Europe.
en Europa. Que confíen en que Europa ha sido
For how
capaz de
long?
construir.
How long should they trust in Europe? Because
Bueno,
the
esta
unemployment
es la
situation
cuestión. Esta es
is
la cuestión.
for the
Hay que
people on the
ser-
ground level,
Sí, sí.
is becoming extremely tight.
Hay que ser claros.
We have to
Por
be
la
very
gravedad
clear
y
about
profundidad de la
this,
crisis.
because it is a
No es una
huge
crisis que se
crisis,
resuelva
and it is not one that will be
en un par
sorted
de
out
años,
in a
como-
couple of
como
years.
hemos visto.
We have already suffered for 4
Llevamos
years,
4 años de crisis
and it is going to take some time to overcome it.
y nos va a costar
And the most important thing at a time of
tiempo
crisis
todavía superarla.
is to keep social cohesion
Lo
to a
más
maximum.
importante es que
I have to point
los
out that in
jóvenes
Spain,
sin
some
empleo,
70% of the unemployed
en
receive
España
public
y en el resto de los
assistance,
países de Europa,
and it's very important to pay attention to social issues and to ensure that young people in Spain and in Europe
el proceso de
have a
recuperación
hope
va a llegar
that in the foreseeable
proceso de
future
incorporación
there
va a
will
llegar
be employment,
al empleo.
that recovery will come with an
una
economy
economía
that is going to be more
será más
productive
productiva.
because all of the reforms that are being
Porque
carried
las
out
reformas
will
que se están
create
haciendo,
a
los
safer
ajustes
Europe.
que se están haciendo
So,
llevarán a eso y en una Europa más segura.
so what you're saying to me then is that Spain is willing to take the medicine indefinitely, and you have no sense of anger against Germany in the way that it has managed to get out of its position while demanding that Spain go through the pain that Spain is enduring.
Bueno, Alemania tuvo una crisis económica al principio, finales de los 90.
Germany experienced an
2000,
economic crisis at the end of the
más leve
90s
que ahora.
and the beginning of
Su crecimiento
2000.
era plano.
Their growth was flat. They implemented reforms and adjustments,
Hizo ajustes.
and then it recovered the confidence in itself as a big
Recobró la
power.
confianza en sí misma
And
como gran
today,
potencia,
Germany has excellent growth and employment figures.
y ahora tiene unas
But
buenas
remember
cifras de
that
crecimiento
since
de
the
empleo.
60s, for the past 40 years, Spain has been growing closer to Germany. In the 60s, our
Ha sido un
GDP
proceso
was
de equilibrio.
60% of Germany's.
Ahora
And
todo
now,
lo vemos
despite
una
the financial crisis,
gran
they are
cortina
only a few points ahead of us
negra.
in terms of per capita product. So
Pero si
we
ponemos
have
un poco la
reduced the
luz
gap.
larga,
The process of the
vemos el
EU
pasado
is a
reciente.
process of balance. At the moment, our
el
outlook is
futuro
very
no de este
pessimistic.
año,
But if we
ni
step
del
back
siguiente,
and look at the past and into
a
the
2-3
future,
años,
not this year or even the
como
next
Europa
year,
vuelve
but probably in
a
2
tener
or
ese
3 years,
potencial de liderazgo.
Europe will be back in leadership and
No
power.
nos olvidemos,
We
no
can't
subestimemos
underestimate
Europa.
Europe. We are the major
una
economic
tendencia.
power of the world. We are
Somos
the European
la
Union.
potencia económica mayor del mundo, la Unión Europea.
I am extremely surprised, I confess, because I expected that you, coming from where you have come from the left of Spanish politics, you are the man who made peace with Hugo Chavez and the left in Latin America. You are the man who famously disagreed with George Bush and had a fairly frosty relationship and pulled your troops away from the coalition of the willing. You are someone who I expected would look at Francois Hollande and say, yes, this is the way that we need to address this issue. And yet you are speaking like a man who doesn't want to rock that boat, who thinks the status quo is the way forward.
No, algo desde mi experiencia y desde la
Speaking from
reflexión
experience and since
durante
leaving
este
office,
tiempo que he salido del-
I have felt that Europe is going to end up with all the
Algunos,
changes
como
it
del Banco
needs
Central,
in
va a
about
costar algo
4 or
más.
5 years' time. Some are going to take longer, like the European Central Bank,
Como
with a single
Una
treasury.
aproximación a un tesoro único también va a costar más.
You're struggling
se
there
van
with
a-
the idea of the European Central
pero
Bank.
se
I
van
mean,
a
you
producir.
never really agreed with them, have you?
Pero eso van a hacer. Eso
But
va-
it's going
va
to
a llegar.
happen at some point.
Van a
In
hacer, va a
Europe,
llegar.
everything is
Ahora, en
democratic.
Europa, las cosas
There's a
se-
political discussion
son
between free and sovereign
democráticas.
countries, and there's
Se
always
producen por
friction,
discusión política.
a tension between
entre
giving up
países
some
libres y
sovereignty
soberanos.
and protecting one's country.
Siempre
That's
hay una
normal.
tensión.
The question, however, for a
Entre ceder
great and
soberanía,
powerful country is to learn from one's mistakes.
Resguardarse.
All the great
país.
nations go through
Es
crises.
comprensible.
History is full of them.
Y
The
que ha puesto
difference
en marcha
is
medidas,
whether or
faltan
not
medidas,
a country learns from a lesson, and I have no
y el
doubt Europe will
objetivo
learn.
último es mantener
There are
el
steps
estado
to
de bienestar,
take, action needed, and we will need
el
more.
estado social.
But the final purpose is to retain social welfare, the social welfare that exists only in Europe and nowhere else in the world. We must defend social rights. And in order to be able to do that and to keep up, we need to make Europe more competitive and productive and more united politically. And Spain is going to be there.
Y España va a estar ahí.
Again, if I may offer the observation, you're speaking the language of a politician, which of course you are. But are you a future politician or a past politician? Because I get a sense from you that there is still a future.
No. El futuro es
The future is for people who are in the political arena today.
And there is no
Eso no
attempt
quiere decir.
My only thought about the future is that Spain will recover its economic growth and get through this grave social crisis, and I am confident that it's going to make it. At this point, there's no political future for me, but that doesn't mean that I don't have a future and that I won't give everything I can to fight this crisis, to support peace building and the consolidation of the Arab Spring, and to see more freedoms and liberties, to fight against climate change, and to give all the input and help I can. I want to offer my humble opinion and help to accomplish the goals of this millennium.
And all those issues, unfortunately, we don't have time for, because this European crisis is at least to many commentators. I mean, you seem to think that it's manageable, but a lot of people seem to think that this is clearly the biggest political problem the world has got right now. When you come to write your memoirs, will you be as fair and even in your remembrance of the events of these past 4 years as you've been today, do you think? Or do you think that there are prices to pay and accusations to be leveled?
Hay que intentar ser ponderado y justo.
We have to be fair and just. Now that I'm out of the political front line, I recognize that it is perfectly rational and legitimate that public opinion, the journalists, ask their political representatives to give answers to everything, every day. A politician in power has to answer questions every 15 seconds. He has to plan long term, he cannot improvise, and like a prophet, he must be able to predict what is going to happen in the future. And that is one of the things that we learn from political responsibility, that things are much more complicated, that we have to provide answers and react to things that happen. But if we look at this century or the second half of the 20th century, in spite of all these very serious crises, there has been a direction towards growth and development. First, are there more democracies than before? Yes. Economic growth is not comparable to anything in the past. Although very slowly, are we reducing extreme poverty? Yes. Is there more capacity globally to be able to work together and cooperate? Not the way we like it, but yes, we are doing so. I was at the G20 summit. But just think back to the 20th century. It was impossible to bring together the big, powerful countries. We had 2 world wars and 1 Cold War. Now, we did face a test at the beginning of this century because it started basically with the September 11th attacks, an event that we thought would ignite a conflict between the Muslim world and the West and East. But 10 years later on, we have the Arab Spring, which is the biggest hope for peace and progress for the southern Mediterranean, as well as for understanding, dialogue and respect between West and East. So when someone is out of office, he can take a step back and look at things more calmly and think about the progress that is inherent to humanity. Now we are facing a really difficult situation, especially in Europe. But we have managed to walk the path of growth and progress, and we will be able to do it again. I have absolutely no doubt about the future of Spain and Europe. The economy is going to recover, and we are going to hold on to welfare, and we are going to make sure that no generation is lost. It is going to take time, and now there are people who really are suffering, but we are not going to allow European and Spanish society to lag behind. This is democracy's greatest asset. Democracy too goes through crises, but it always overcomes them, and it always has a future.
Y siempre gana el futuro.
Thank you very much for talking to us.
Muchísimas gracias, Al Jazeera. Gracias.